My name is Jim Robinson. I'm from Spokane, Washington. I'm a 62-year-old individual who spent much of the 60s and 70s wondering what in the world was going on. I voted for a lot of Democrats, independents, and I really didn't know who I was voting for or what I was doing. But in 1981, after being a seeker for a few years, I spotted an advertisement regarding the John Birch Society presentation for somebody by the name of Thomas Schumann. When I got there, I discovered he was actually a Soviet who had defected. His name was Yuri Bezmenov. And I remember part of his presentation. I was sitting right in the middle, and he pointed this big bony finger at me, and he said in his broken English, "If the lamp of liberty goes out in America, where will the boat people go?" And that really surprised me because I had never thought of that before. And so through the years, in discovering and seeking, about 1984, I was asked by somebody in my precinct known as a precinct committee officer, I didn't even know what that was at the time, to run for the executive board of the local county party, which I was available, so I did. And I won. Fortunately, someone took me under their wing. They told me who the players were, what I should and should not do in getting started. And in 1988, because I was a member of the executive board of the county party, during a program called by the chairman, the Road to 88, and there was real excitement about it, nobody wanted to chair the effort to bring Pat Robertson to town, who was running for president. I volunteered. During that effort, I became the chair of the Eastern Washington effort to elect Pat Robertson. That was quite a scene because I had no idea what I was doing. But fortunately, there were people that came alongside me that did know more than I did. That was extraordinarily successful because we organized in the precincts. We used a mechanism and an organization that was already in place for our benefit. In 2008, someone else ran for president that caught my interest because my wife and I had been supporting him for several years. His name was Ron Paul. So since this organization was already in place, we had leadership in position there. Spokane County elected 107 out of 111 delegates for Ron Paul in our county. And we went on, we were only about 6 seconds in a procedural move from taking the state convention as well. As it were, since we did not have the podium, we got squashed. We still had a significant number of delegates. How does this relate? Oh. Will Rogers said, "I don't make jokes, I just watch the government and report the facts." In America, statistics show that less than 5% of the registered voters actively participate within the fabric of politics. Within that small number, there's even a smaller percentage who comprise leadership of both liberal and conservative activists. Within that tiny percentage, the fate of our nation rests. I'd like to think that this is a group who've chosen the red pill, who've decided that they want to know how deep the rabbit hole goes and what reality really is, how we can take this republic back. Currently, how do we influence public policy? Well, we send letters to the editor, to our elected representatives. We communicate with them in various ways. Actually, I didn't really finish my introduction. A few years ago, I met an individual by the name of Matt Shea, and I was impressed by his maturity for his age, both spiritually and emotionally, and his knowledge, and encouraged him to run for office, which he did. And then I came out of retirement and went to work for him as LA. Matt, would you stand, please? He is the individual from Washington State who introduced the 10th Amendment resolution, and believe me, we got response from all over the United States. It was absolutely amazing. We also hold demonstrations at City Hall, the courthouse, and the state capitol. This last year we experienced some significant demonstrations at our state capitol in Olympia, Washington, for traditional marriage, for everything from lower taxes to but did it do any good? Well, we like to think that it did do some good. In the legislature, the Republican caucus held the line. There were no new taxes passed. There were a few fee increases. But for being in a decided minority in both houses, without the advantage of owning the governor, they really held the line. The left controls the institutions, government, especially executive branch employees. You see the left has basically embedded their people at all levels. If you take a look at the National Forest Service, for example, you see that the environmental community has their people almost everywhere in the United States. The media moguls are basically CFR members. Education has already been announced during this conference that education is virtually a dead duck. The banking financial institutions and foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie. I remember many years ago watching a 16-millimeter tape recording of presentation of the director of the Ford Foundation explaining how we need to bring the United States down and the rest of the third world up so that we can be comfortably merged into a new world order. And especially they control the agenda. And I just want to point out that I use the term the left here as those who believe in or work towards an international socialist world government. The agenda of the left, of course, is to change the U.S. so it can be easily merged with the rest of the world in a globalist socialist government. And our agenda, of course, is to try to restore things, to decrease the size and cost of government, increase government control, restore the Republic and the Constitution, and preserve sovereignty and liberty. So where is the common ground between those two agendas? Is there somewhere that we can both comfortably exist? Or is that sort of a no man's land that neither can comfortably exist at? Where maybe both opposing groups have part of the ground, but not all of it. The answer here is that there is not any common ground between liberty and tyranny. There is no such thing. Senator Richardson, who is the author of Confrontational Politics, said bad ideas don't die of their own accord. They have to be killed by better ones. We use a lot of tools in influencing public policy, political parties. We seem to have a huge choice there. Advocacy groups, political action committees, and clubs and organizations. For our purposes, we're going to be talking about political parties. Of all those political parties, I just listed the ones that are floating here. The ones that are really down in the bottom of the septic tank I didn't list. But the Republican Party is the one that we're going to be using here because it's the one that I have experience with. In reality, if you decide that you want to be a part of the Democrat Party or any of these other parties, the Constitution Party, so a lot of my very, very good friends, or some, have taken leadership positions in the Constitution Party, these concepts and these principles will work there just as well. The Republican Party organization is very similar in structure both geographic and politically, as other parties. It's just that there's more of everything in the Republican Party than the Democrat Party. And in the Republican Party, I noticed when comparing notes with little pieces of evidence I've collected as how the Democrat Party conducts their business, the Republican Party is much more influenced by the grassroots from the bottom up. That, of course, there is a move to try to change that, but currently it is very heavily influenced by the grassroots. The parts of the Republican Party we're going to be talking about are at the precinct, the district, and the county level. Of course, there are very important aspects of the Republican Party and other parties at the state and national level, but for our purposes here, we're going to stick with these three levels. The precinct is, of course, the smallest geographic political entity, usually about 900 voters, maybe 1,500 at the most. The district is usually a collection. It's a legislative district, but usually the larger legislative districts in the metropolitan areas are broken up into small sub-districts, and it is a subset of the district. And the district, of course, is divided up by population in each state, representing the state in the state house. And of course, you have the county organization. We have non-party organizations that you will be interfacing with at the same time. In my house, I may wear the party hat in the morning, a campaign hat in the afternoon, and the next morning I'll be at a gun show or wearing some other kind of advocacy hat. Because of your experience in the party, though, usually what happens is that your stature in these other organizations increases. In the precinct, like I said, we have about 900 to 1,500 registered voters in each precinct. It's easily organized by a single individual, and that's an extremely important point, in that in order to relate to an effective number of people in your precinct, all it takes is one person. Questions that you should be asking about this precinct: who is the precinct committee officer or captain? Is the office filled? Is it vacant? And if it's filled, is this precinct committee officer active? In other words, are they really doing their job, or are they just taking up space? The precinct committee officer has a 2-year term, elected in even years. Typically, it's a $1 filing fee to file for the position. Usually your name appears on the primary ballot. But there is another opportunity for you too between those times, that if it's vacant, you could be appointed by the chair of the county party. I just want to make a point right here. If you are seeking out the Republican Party, if you have not been involved with the party before, and of course I'm speaking here to the choir, you have a whole range of experiences with party politics, from possibly no involvement at all to far greater involvement than I have had in the last 25 years. I think that I should say, though, that if you're going to contact the party, your first contact should be very vanilla. I know that I have heard individuals spill the whole boat on their first contact with the party, but you should try to be what the party expects you to be, just a generic Republican. And that's how I had always presented myself. I had been advised to do that. I had always presented myself as someone who was most interested in promoting the Republican Party and electing Republicans to office, which is the primary mission of any party, to promote the concept and and elect your people to office. So it is very important to use discernment when volunteering so that since you don't know who the other players are, you don't know who you're talking to, you could very well be talking to somebody who really doesn't agree with you at all, and in which case your telephone call may go unheeded. When you are a precinct committee officer, you are a bona fide elected partisan official in that precinct. You have usually access to Republican Party lists, and you have credentials in your precinct. In other words, you contact other people in your precinct, either by foot or by phone, and you can identify yourself as a precinct committee officer in this precinct, in this neighborhood. You do have some tools available to you. Sometimes they may not be readily available to you, but you do have tools available to you. Those are maps. I have used maps extensively, identified hundreds and hundreds of individuals by where they live and identified the precinct that they live in, and use that information to build effective list that we could sort by precinct and identify our supporters in the precinct. You can also identify where all your friends and relatives live and encourage them to become precinct committee officers and active in their precinct. You'll have access to public and private lists. A private list, of course, within the Republican Party. The public lists are the ones that you can get at the election department. Voter Vault is one such private list. We're up to Voter Vault 3 in the Republican Party now, and there's a lot of criticism about Voter Vault, about it not being accurate. But I tell people that it's a starting point that you can use in your precinct to narrow down a little bit who your friends are and who your friends are not to get started. And in the precinct, as a precinct committee officer, your primary mission is to develop relationships, whether by telephone or face-to-face. When you're developing these relationships with other people in your precinct, you use the tools that you have before you to identify your constituency. And of course, with Voter Vault, about 30% of the people in your precinct on average have already been identified in some way. And of course, it's not 100% accurate, but for the most part, I've had very good luck with it. So you can identify your constituency, you know where they live, you know what their telephone number is usually, and in some cases, about 25-30% of the cases, you'll find that you know a little bit about them, if they're a hard Democrat, a hard Republican, or somewhere in between. When you call them or contact them, I would urge you to use discernment and restraint. Ask questions, shut up, don't be adversarial, because you're giving them an opportunity to tell you who they are. And eventually, of course, with some of these people, you're going to be bringing them into activist circles. Just a couple notes about where you get these lists. The voter list, of course, to your county auditor or your county election department, Republican Party. The Voter Vault list has to be approved by your local Republican Party chair. It's available to precinct committee officers and those elected officers in the Republican Party, and certain others in Republican campaigns, and certain others, as you'll find out later. You have to sign a confidentiality agreement not to share this with other people, and you have to be approved, which means that if you have an antagonistic chair or someone between the chair and the state party, it could take a little while and it could require a little bit of urging on your part. The telephone process if you have a list in front of you of, let's just say voter vault to start with, and you've identified who the hard Republicans are, and you've, out of your precinct of, say, roughly 900 individuals, you've discovered that there are about 25 or 30 known Republicans who always vote Republican. And for those of you who haven't done this before, I would recommend that you start out with this list, with the friendly list. You'll find that the telephone is a lot lighter. It's not that 500-pound telephone. It's only 100 or 200 pounds, and it will be easier to develop a relationship with these individuals because you have something in common. A recommended scenario here is simply to call them, identify themselves. Hello, my name is Jim Robinson. I'm the precinct committee officer in our community here. And I just thought I'd call you and see what your concerns are regarding the world today and our country and the state in which it's in, the challenges that we have. Is there any particular issue that really is bothering you? And then shut up and listen. Take notes, take copious notes, because what they're going to tell you is exactly what you want to know to develop a relationship with that individual. If you discover that this person's hot button is the Second Amendment, let him talk about the Second Amendment until that person is completely done. And then ask him, are there any other, I know that's really important and I couldn't agree more, but are there any other issues that you think that we really need to address today? And then again, resist the urge to dive right in and say, yeah, right, and contribute to the conversation, because that is not the point at which you want to contribute to the conversation. When this person is done and is empty and has finished, what you basically want to do is make certain that you've identified your notes, that you have Tom Jones at the top, precinct 4023, phone number, email address, and you want to say, gee, I am so glad that you shared this with me. I think these are really important issues too. I have to go now, but I'd sure like to touch bases every once in a while. I'd just like to urge you to call me at any time at this number. You can also share your email address if you feel comfortable about it. And then say thank you very much, goodbye, and go on to the next call. What's happened? Well, first of all, they feel very good because somebody called up, was genuinely concerned about what they felt. How many times does that happen in a person's lifetime when someone in some political office calls them up and lets them go until they're completely unwound? I'm trying to think about one case in which someone has done that for me, but I can't. If you live in a community where it's easy to go door to door, you can do that face to face. But I have to tell you that I prefer, personally, the telephone because it's much easier to take notes on the telephone than it is face to face. If you're standing there in front of them, making notes as fast as you can go while they're talking, it can set them ill at ease at times. What I would recommend you do is try to get back to your car or to your house as soon as possible. Make as many notes as you can about the direction of the conversation and what that individual really felt about and their hot topics. But I personally prefer the telephone. One thing about building this kind of these kind of relationships in your precinct is that you can create your own list of what I call the saints, sinners, and savables. You will talk to people in your precinct that go on and on about how we need single-payer health care in America. It's not likely, but you're going to talk to individuals that really feel that the way to save America is with more socialism, rather than less. You're going to put those in the center file. The ones that agree with you, of course, will go in the saints file, and those people who really are wondering what in the world is going on in the savables file, because those are people that you will be able to share information with bit by bit. Again, I say bit by bit, because I remember about 25, 30 years ago when we first started discovering, we wanted that little beep, beep, beep you hear. Well, that's our political truck backing up. We're going to give them the whole load. And I can't remember how. I wish we could go back and recover some of those instances. And I see some smiles around the room because some of you had done the same thing. I gave them the whole load, and my wife, after I gave them the whole load, she'd come in and make certain that if there was any piece of them sticking out of the pile, that was covered up too. So frustrating, but eventually we developed some restraint. I'm still working on it. I think I missed a couple here. Okay. Once you have developed your list of saint sinners and savables in your precinct, and you feel comfortable, and I use that, that's kind of a qualified term. Comfortable is a relative term that you don't feel totally uncomfortable contacting individuals in your precinct. You want to volunteer to help fill neighboring precincts, because this is where the real power comes in within any party structure, is to find those individuals that agree with our liberty-minded point of view and encourage those people to take leadership positions in their precinct. And again, I emphasize leadership positions, because as a precinct committee officer, you are a leader in your precinct, and you have great opportunities when you do so. It will give them access, and you will give you access too, to those precinct lists when you fill those precincts with liberty-minded folks that are in the same frequency as you are. And then you need to ask, what about this district leader position? Who are they and what do they do? The district leader is typically a voting member of the county Republican Executive Board, elected by the precinct committee officers in that district, and can influence the direction of the party using, of course, discretion and discernment, because in virtually every county in America, you'll have people in that party that cover virtually the entire political spectrum. The district leader is an individual that not only votes and determines the direction of the party, but also is a leader of that group of precincts and recruits precinct committee officers, teaches and encourages and mentors those precinct committee officers. So it's a party position, but also it's a position in which you as an individual really are influencing public policy and are bringing up new leaders who are going to discover that they can participate in organizations like Freedom21, they can participate in Eagle Forum and all sorts of other organizations. You will find that they will branch out quickly and will find their place. There's a few notes on discernment and, of course, discretion. Discretion, the root word being discreet. You don't want to tell everybody everything that you know and every little detail of your entire life and what you believe. And the discerning really is knowing the players, to identify their motives. Why is this person participating in the party? And I think what I want to do here is talk about some of the other parties. One in particular that I really like. It's like a party that was custom made for Jim Robinson, and that's the Constitution Party. I have explained to many who are part of that party that once that party gains political stature in a community and is electing individuals to city council or the state legislature, that they will be challenged with the same individuals that we are in the Republican Party. In other words, those who seek out positions that they can use to accumulate political power for their own advantage. These people would not be defined as statesmen, but rather politicians. And they are going to be challenged with those same individuals that will be seeking out offices and political positions within their party as we are here. And it's my personal opinion, why not fight them right here, right there in the Republican Party? It already has wheels on the ground. It already has all the machinery in place in 50 states. Agreed. The Republican Party at the top levels is so corrupt that it just makes me physically sick to my stomach sometimes. And in many state Republican parties, it's reflected in the same way. Washington State is a prime example. But where it really counts is at the grassroots. And if, and this is a big if sometimes, but the if applies to all parties, if we can find our people, like the people in this room and the people that you associate with in your communities, in your state, can be convinced to challenge those liberals, socialists, and go along people in party positions, can challenge them for their office, and are willing to stand up and fight for those positions, we will find that we will start to prevail in many cases and win these positions of power that we can use to our advantage, we can use to restore the republic, that we can use to unshackle this country from the chains of socialism. Because in the past, we have been content to sit back and let others go to all those messy meetings and those boring sessions. I can't think of one Republican Party meeting in going on 30 years that was a fun one. Not one. And yet, sometimes when I was giving myself a pity party, complete with balloons and everything, I would remind myself that I was there not because this is a fun thing, because it was my duty. I hearken back to Adams, who said, "Duty is ours, results are God's." And I suck it up and take notes and go about my business. Part of learning who the players are is even developing relationships with those that you really disagree with, who you recognize as being in those positions simply because they feel that it's their duty to wield that political power for their advantage and those around them. And once you develop this list of who the players are and what their motives are, you will be able to find those people that agree with you and start networking with them and building that power block in that county party. This is exactly what we have done over the past few years. One of the first things that I was introduced to in 1984 or 5 was the pre-meeting before the executive board meeting. And that was a meeting of those of us who held conservative beliefs to sit down and examine the agenda that had been provided for us by the chairman and determine what we wanted to accomplish within this meeting, within that single meeting. And if there was some motion that we would want to make, we would decide how the motion would be worded, who would make the motion, who would second the motion. If there were 3 salient points that we needed to make about this motion, decide who the people were that were going to speak on each one of those points. We didn't leave anything to question. Well, sometimes you can't anticipate everything, but we tried to anticipate as much as we could. We would find that when we were in the meeting, that our actions were much more relaxed and comfortable, and to the other side seemed spontaneous. I can remember some of those early meetings. The chair was someone who was really not one of us. I remember the treasurer, who one of our group nicknamed the Lanky Liar. I won't name him by name, but he would get so upset by what was happening, by the political dynamics that were occurring at the time, that you could see him. He was a big, tall guy. He was squirming in his seat, and he would, every once in a while, his hand would hit the table like this. He didn't know what was going on. He may have suspected, but he didn't know for sure. We only had about 30% of the board. And yet we prevailed about 90% of the time, because we'd identified that they'd only have 20 or 25% of the board, and the rest of them were kind of floating around in space. If we had our presentation ready, we knew the 20% didn't know it was coming. They didn't have any idea what was coming. They weren't prepared. They weren't ready. They were only available to react. And we were there with our little scripts, all filed away. So it works. It really works at times. And you will find that you can get your way in a setting like a party executive board by doing exactly that. Meeting ahead of time, close enough to the meeting so that nothing can change. And be frank with you, we'd meet before the executive board meeting, have dinner, compare notes, chit-chat, and then pick up the agenda and go down it item by item, trying to anticipate what was going to happen. Under tactics and techniques, knowing and framing the issues, I think it's very important that you are ahead of the wave. If there is an event coming up in your community, if you just heard that there is a candidate anticipating announcing, use this information to develop your own agenda. In that pre-meeting, you may want to make a statement. You may want to make a motion that you have heard about a candidate. You want to make a motion to endorse that candidate, that liberty-minded candidate that's planning on running, before the other side has a chance to do the same for their candidate. It's happened in Spokane, and it can happen in your area as well. The pre-meeting is a subject that comes up rarely in circles, but it's a device that can be used so effectively to change the course of your party. They've been doing it to us for many years. It's time we put the shoe on the other foot. The difference is that when you take a look at the grassroots, you will see that we have the numbers, they have the podium. All we need to do is use our numbers to capture the podium. One particular, in terms of grassroots and the direction of the party, as long as you let the neighborhood socialists occupy those positions of leadership, they most certainly will accommodate you. At the last half a dozen county conventions in our county, motions like getting us out of the UN have passed virtually unanimously. by the delegates at the county convention. Then why were we fighting so hard to gain these positions within the party? Just a note. It's because those people who were voting for you didn't know the difference between you and them. Once you establish your relationship with the people in your precinct, it's a huge tool that can be used to elect delegates to county conventions who already know you and trust you, who have that relationship with you, who know that you're willing to listen to them and their concerns, and they're very willing to accept your leadership. And I get back to that term again, leadership, because in your precinct, you are a leader and an important one. One of the elements, of course, is the reorganization meeting. The county reorg, sometimes there's a district reorg in metropolitan areas like Seattle and Minneapolis. And New York has district chairs that they have areas that are larger than Spokane County. But for the purposes here, what we're going to be talking about are the average size county. Smaller counties, of course, everything will happen in one meeting. You don't have district chairs. You'll have delegates that are elected within the county. But these are all things that can be easily learned from individuals within your county. If you have a county that has only 15 or 20 precincts, then obviously you're not going to have some of the same challenges, but you're still going to have the same neocons and liberals and socialists that want to seek out positions in the party, all parties that have political influence. The reorganization meeting occurs each even year. I'll first talk about the county reorganization meeting, in which the precinct committee officers that were just elected in the previous primary election will in December, usually the first or second Saturday in December, meet to elect the leadership of the county party. The leadership consists of the chair, the vice chair, the state committee man, and the state committee woman. Those are voting leadership. Many counties elect secretaries, they elect treasurers, they have various offices that are elected at this, but we're going to just stick with the basic offices. They will elect a chair, vice chair, state committee man, and state committee woman. The state committee man and committee woman are representatives from that county who will sit on the central committee of the state party. The chair in some states has a vote on that executive board. And after the county reorganization meetings have been completed and all the state committee people and chairs have been elected, the representatives from each county will meet with a state reorganization meeting sometime in January to elect the state leadership. That meeting will produce a chair and a vice chair, and in some states, a national committee man and a national committee woman. The national committee man and committee woman that will then meet later on that year in national convention and a national reorg to elect the national leadership. So you can see that the national leadership starts with the election of a precinct committee officer. And in this imaginary world in which every precinct committee officer finds 10 or 20 people in their precinct that agree with them and builds their precinct organization, has their little list of saints and sinners, builds this up the chain. In simply 2 years, you can recapture the Republican Party with freedom and liberty-minded individuals in power positions within the RNC. It would not happen without a huge fight, but it's very doable. I'm going to be asking a couple of real-life people in our county that have utilized their office to effect change, not just within the party, but in the community. Because once you become a leader within the Republican Party, you will find that you will be drawn and asked to participate in other organizations as well. But this is a leadership culture, like a leadership petri dish in the precinct. And it cultivates leaders that become lobbyists, that become leaders of political action committees, that become leaders of national organizations. But in a great many cases, that's where it starts. The first person I'm going to ask to come forward is Cindy Zapataki. She is the, oops, what did I do? Well, I'm going to jump forward here and ask Cindy to come forward and then go backwards. She is chair of the Spokane County Republican Party. She likes to characterize herself as a housewife and a mother of 4 boys. And she's going to talk about using her position to advocate for meaningful speakers at GOP events like Tom DeWeese. Cindy?
Well, this is my first time here, and it's just been so exciting, and I find my new job very exciting. It's amazing that when you hear so much gloom and doom all across the country, that in Spokane County we're very excited about the present and the future. There's a lot we can do, and I have to tell you, from the time I was a little girl talking about leadership, I had a dad who was a street kid from Tacoma, clawed his way up to go to college on an athletic scholarship at Washington State University. And one of his goals for his 2 daughters was that they never feel like they have to be a victim. My dad taught us to use the tools we had and to work hard and to participate and be engaged in our community and be engaged in our lives, and not just let outside influences tell you that you had to do anything or be anything necessarily, that you had ways to live your life in a good way, and you didn't have to go to school and be beaten up on the playground just because you were a girl, and you didn't have to accept people's notions of who you were, that you could challenge within boundaries that were appropriate your position in life. So I've always felt like I could influence things if I worked hard enough and educated myself and worked with other people who were like-minded. So that's what I brought to this job. One of the things I've learned about this job is that there are a lot of people that view politics as checkers. Politics and governing are not checkers, they're chess. And that means strategy. And I just realized that Jim Robinson is really a community organizer. Long before Barack Obama was even born, Jim was organizing in my community. And so he and others laid a huge amount of groundwork so that by the time I moved to Spokane in 2001, all the groundwork pretty much had been laid by these people to begin to move into the Republican Party in Spokane County with liberty-minded patriots like me. The first time I ran for an office in Spokane County, I got beaten for the vice chair position by a woman who seemed to be energetic and seemed to be well connected and well liked in the community. And I got up and I was very honest about who I was. And with some people that didn't go over very well. So she was given 6 months to show what she could do, and basically she didn't do much. She talked a lot, and she smiled a lot, but she didn't do much. And so by the time that the chair position became available, chair and co-chair position 6 months later, people had seen that she didn't do much. And I think that's sort of the key to where we are today in this country, is that for a lot of years people have talked a lot about what could be and how it should be and what they're unhappy about. But when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, we all are looking around us and we're seeing that the values that we have are slipping away, and the society is being turned by a minority, a very vocal, hardworking, aggressive, lying, cheating minority, because our side fails to show up and fails to do the work that it takes to influence public policy. In our county, I was ultimately elected by standing up in front of the people that were precinct committee officers who elected me. And I promised them that I would work hard and that I would get results and that I would communicate with them. And my re-election next year will depend on how well I fulfill my promises. I think it's interesting when I read Peggy Noonan's book about, it's called, it's on Ronald Reagan now, it just slipped my mind, but she has 2 books out. The first one was sort of negative because she had just become a speechwriter for Reagan and she was a Democrat Catholic and she wasn't totally on board with Reagan, but as she worked with him, she began to appreciate him. And we all know that he wasn't perfect, but there's a lot to admire about Ronald Reagan. And one of the things that she said in her second book, When Character Was King, is the name of the book. And I would recommend that you all read that book. Get it from Amazon, get used copies if you can, because you really get to look at the inside of how the man operated. And she said when she first wrote the book, she wanted to find out if he kept every promise that he'd ever made politically. She'd heard that about him, but she said she was going to spend years and she was going to go talk to people and she was going to go to California and she was going to go to the Screen Actors Guild in California, which is really a union, by the way. Ronald Reagan was a union man. And see if he kept his promises. And guess what she found out? He kept his promises. And in the book, she makes an interesting statement. She said, Ronald Reagan always kept his promises, but he never made a promise that he couldn't keep. And that's an interesting thing for all of us to consider, is that if you're going to step out and you're going to influence public policy and take positions of leadership, you have to know what's possible, you have to know yourself, you have to know what is going to be required of you to actually fulfill the promises that you make. And the bottom line is going to be a lot of commitment and a lot of hard work. I'm basically a volunteer. I don't get paid for what I do. So you really have to have a fire in your belly and believe that your cause is just and that your cause is right, and you have to be willing to do the work that it takes. One of the first things we realized in our community is that the people in our community were generally unhappy with things, but they didn't know what to do about it. And we needed to bring people in from the outside like Tom DeWeese and Jim Gilchrist. We needed to educate our people, but we also needed to activate our people. So one of the first people that we did bring to our town was Jim Gilchrist to talk about immigration and what was happening on the border with the Minutemen. And of course, the minute that we made our announcement, there were death threats. I mean, La Raza found out and they were going to picket us, and it got sort of scary. They never showed up, but at least they made the threats. And we brought Jim Gilchrist in, and he talked about what he did. And that didn't mean that everybody in the room agreed with Jim Gilchrist, but it was such an eye-opener. And it was exciting to meet a man who had been a CPA in California, and he decided that he was going to do something about something that he didn't like. And so he organized, and he did something about what he didn't like, and it was very exciting for our people. And also, I think that in the state of Washington and even beyond the state of Washington, bringing Jim Gilchrist into the Pacific Northwest was a big deal. And even though the newspaper didn't want to cover it, as usual, they couldn't resist because he was a national name and a national personality. And so they did cover it. And they did actually send a reporter to come and listen to what he had to say. And what it did is it injected into our community some dialoguing. People started to talk about immigration reform in a serious way and realized that, you know, there were other ways to deal with it. And then when we brought Tom DeWeese last year, the same thing happened. He comes from the outside. He's from Virginia. He has an organization they can plug into. He has a website. He has materials. And people got excited because they found out there was somebody out there that had an organization that was attempting to influence public policy, that had a voice, and it made them think, gee, maybe I can have a voice too. So this gets excitement into the community, and it gets dialogue into the community. And that's the way that I've tried to use the power of my position. You can use it as a bully pulpit, which I don't do, actually, because what I've done, we have in our party now the former chair, who is probably more moderate than I am, to say the least. He's a retired military officer. He's very careful with what he says. The press likes him because they perceive him as sort of non-threatening. And he has become the spokesman for our party. And he goes out and he meets with the press. He already knows them. They print stuff that he says. He almost never says anything controversial. And that's fine with me, because the press isn't my friend. If they found out more about me, they probably wouldn't like me that much anyway. But what we're trying to do is organize on the grassroots level and really activate our base, get them excited, and begin to get people into positions of leadership. And of course, when Matt Shea ran his campaign, it was very exciting for us because here we had a young, aggressive, smart candidate who appealed to people in his district, and we put in a lot of time and effort to get him elected. And I think that's important for everybody in this room to remember, is that the ultimate goal for our movement is to get people elected to office where they really can influence public policy. And they will have an even bigger bully pulpit than what we have in our county government. And Matt went to the state legislature this year, which is heavily Democrat liberal. And he excited the House Republican caucus in our state. He inputted knowledge, he inputted energy, he inputted a can-do attitude, and he got them excited. And they blocked most of the tax increase bills that the Democrats in our state wanted to put through. He totally, and I think he intimidated, and the House Republicans intimidated a majority that are liberal Democrats. They got so upset that they got confused, and they sort of forgot what they were there for, which was to shove through all these tax increases. It was just the most amazing thing to watch, what a small group of little guerrilla fighters could do in the middle of a much larger number. I want to leave you with two thoughts here. Two of my heroes from the Bible are Joshua and Gideon. And I often think about the lessons of what you read there. Even if you're not a Christian or a Bible scholar, you might read about Joshua and Gideon. Joshua crossed the Jordan River after Moses passed away, and he led the Israelites against the city of Jericho. And he must have stood before the walls of Jericho, which were something like 7 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet thick, and thought, how are we ever going to get through those walls? They're so big. These people have been here for a long time. But God had a plan, and when he told Joshua the plan, Joshua obeyed the plan, and he marched around the city 7 times with his people, and they blew the horns. And archaeologists have found, when they dug up Jericho, that the walls fell inward. They always wanted to go dig up Jericho when I was a kid because they wanted to prove that the walls didn't fall inward like the Bible says. They fell outward. No, the walls fell inward because they obeyed, and they found the crack in the wall. And we need to remember that. What we see is these huge walls that we think we can't get through. What we need to do is find the crack in the wall that'll bring the whole wall down. You don't have to attack the whole wall. You just have to find that little crack that will cause a chain reaction that will bring down a huge, massive wall. The second thing is Gideon. Gideon was asked to go against the Assyrian army, which had far superior numbers. And what he was asked to do ultimately was to trim his army down to the most enthusiastic and the smartest and the best. And so Gideon went up against the Assyrians with far fewer numbers than he even started out with. We need to remember that. What we need is people who are committed to working, they're committed to their values, they're committed to their cause. We need to organize those people, and we need to get them going forward in one direction. And frankly, I think we're going to be very surprised if we do that. We're already beginning to see the results of that. You know, we don't need a vast equipment. We don't need a vast army. We need a few good people who are committed and are willing to work hard to accomplish their goal. So I thank you for your time.
In a case where you have a party chair like Cindy, you're not dealing with antagonistic party leadership. But when you are, I want to make a comment here that you really need to prepare yourself if you intend to oppose them. I can remember many years ago with an individual named Bill, who was chair at the time. He was a very skilled attorney, and something happened during the meeting that it lit me up. And so I decided to cross swords with him right there. Well, the problem is that I was unprepared. I had not done my homework. I was not prepared to challenge him in this arena. He had done all of his homework, and he sliced and diced me. He had me so trashed that when I made my way to the parking garage and got in my old pickup, I neglected to notice that my front wheels were angled sharply to the left, and I just, in a daze, stuck it in reverse and backed up and bashed in my left fender. And every time I looked at that fender after that, it would remind me that I really needed to do my homework, and before I went into meetings like that, I needed to be prepared, because I was usually going up against people who had greater skills than I did. I really want to thank publicly Cindy for the job that she has done. It has taken a lot of nerve and courage to say and do the things that she has done. We had, like Jim Gilchrist, 3 years ago, a couple years ago, was a fellow from Competitive Enterprise Institute, talked about the environment, wrote Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming, can't remember his name right now, and then Tom DeWeese this last year. The other individual, let's see a page back here, is Gloria Clark. She's a former secretary of the Spokane County Republican Party. She's a researcher and activist. Her husband, Dan, Stand Up Dan, he is the district leader in the Republican Party. Now, that's what a district leader looks like. Gloria is an individual who makes herself available with the party. She has always been in there. And she's now going to talk a little bit about how her experience, how the Republican Party, because of the way that we have built the base in the party, that it has been available to influence public policy in our area. Would you come forward while I finish this up? I think it was Tom DeWeese that pointed out to us, or maybe it was Michael Shaw, I can't remember, of the 500 ICLEI cities in the United States, only one has experienced any objections to their agenda. That just happened to be Spokane, Washington. And it happened to be generated by the Republican Party of all sources. It usually is a source of mediocrity rather than people who challenge those who have a quest for a new world order. But with that, Gloria, would you please share with us?
I've been a political activist for 20 years. My husband swears that I wore out the kitchen floor in front of the fax machine when I ran a 1,000-member phone tree across Washington State to stop ed reform. And we had mothers organized in every city and town across the state from Aberdeen to Zillow, Washington. And so we would send faxes to the next woman, and then she would write it down, and then she'd call the next person. I don't know how it always ended up at the end, but anyway, we did have a huge showing of people that would show up in Olympia and say, we don't want this education reform. Now, when we listen to Chapman, we find out that it is international education. And another thing that really got me upset was my daughter was hypnotized in a guided visualization experience in junior high, and I started doing my research, and 10 years later I found out that that was disguised hypnosis. So a friend of mine and I wrote a bill, and Representative Mark Stirk ran the bill to stop hypnosis, meditation, and yoga in the schools. So that shows that a couple of mothers that are ticked off can really make a difference. So I would encourage any mothers or fathers here that don't like what's happening in the schools to take a stand. I also want to let you know that I started listening to Michael Shaw on Radio Liberty. He had a program every Wednesday night on American Christian Network radio station in Spokane, and he was talking about sustainable development. And every Wednesday night I just couldn't wait to listen to him for a whole hour, and I would take notes, and I filled several notebooks. And of course he was a speaker here yesterday, and he talked about sustainable development in Agenda 21. So I said to my husband, let's go to that conference. I went to this conference 5 years ago, and I was so excited. I came back to Spokane and started telling people about Agenda 21, and nice Republicans would pull me aside and say, you sound kooky. You're not supposed to say Agenda 21. And I was reprimanded, and I said, why not? It's true. And I am that type of person. It is true. My dad was a Democrat. He would go to the city council meetings, and he would bring the Constitution with him and talk in the city council meeting about how they weren't following the Constitution. And so we Republicans have to stand up. And I fell in love with the Republican Party 20 years ago because we do have a conservative platform that is for life, liberty, and property. And I'm proud to be a Republican, and I don't think anybody should be ashamed. It's just the people that are being elected that are not following the Republican Party that should be ashamed of themselves. Anyway, we have made inroads. Jim was talking about at the City Council, we are one of 500 cities across the, I don't know if it's international, 500 cities that are following ICLEI, which ICLEI means International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. So we are following basically greenhouse gas emission, following the Kyoto Protocol in our city. And it is an Agenda 21 international public-private partnership. That's what an ICLEI city is. And so we showed up when the mayor's sustainability action plan was on the docket to be voted on. And of course, they usually just push everything through, but Nancy McLaughlin, our city councilwoman, who's a conservative Christian Republican, asked us at the reorg meeting back in December, would you please show up and stand behind me? I feel like I'm all alone. I need some Republicans there to do some research and stand up and testify. So that's what we did. We testified, and there were only 4 of us that night, but the couple weeks later, there were 20 of us that exposed the fact that ICLEI is in fact a United Nations public-private partnership that has come into town, and they're forcing international agendas. And then we got Tom DeWeese, as Cindy mentioned, to speak at our Lincoln Day dinner, and everybody who's a Republican knows that you have a Lincoln Day dinner once a year to make money to give the Republican candidates. So Tom showed up and exposed the fact that what ICLEI cities are. I think if I were you, I would check on Google to see if your city is in fact an ICLEI city. I got the environmental programs manager out of the city of Spokane to admit, in fact, when I stood up there and testified, and I had a stack of papers about this thick that proved that we were following Agenda 21 as an ICLEI city, and I got the program environmental director of Spokane, a nice man, to admit we are dues-paying members of ICLEI. And of course, the liberal publication, The Inlander, called us a bunch of tin hats because they want to discredit anyone that mentions the United Nations. But I think anybody that follows this information will find out that we are, in fact, following an international program via greenhouse carbon emission to change our whole way of life. You notice the little cars in the picture this morning? When my son went to France, they had tiny little cars. That's what they have in store for us. If we have cars at all, we'll also have to have walkable communities, and we've tried to expose this. This is what we're in store for. So we need to guard our way of life, and we need to stand up. We're going to be having in Spokane, the Spokane County Republican Party, in conjunction with the Gonzaga University College Republicans, we are going to have a property rights education conference on August 20th, and we're having William Perry Penley from the Mountain States Legal Foundation, who wrote the book Warriors of the West, Fighting Bureaucrats, Radical Groups, and Liberal Judges in America's Frontier. Plus, we're getting 10 other speakers. And it's only $40, and that includes lunch, because we are on the cutting edge. We have to expose this. These sustainability action plans that are being implemented right in our town, we have to expose what's happening. And so we are taking a stand to try to educate people to make a difference in their community. And I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gloria. I'm very proud of Gloria and all the other individuals, and Dan, who keeps her fueled up and supports her. Just have a couple minutes left. I want to cover a couple of points that I think are extremely important when executing your plan of occupying positions of leadership in the Republican Party. And I want to point out and emphasize again that without the leadership positions that we had in the Republican Party, much of this would have gone unnoticed, unheard, and essentially ignored. As it were, the battle over Spokane and its position as an ICLEI city has just begun, and it is going to continue until the city of Spokane renounces ICLEI and all of its goals and resigns and terminates the contract that they have with ICLEI. Two points. Stand your ground. Once you occupy these positions, there is no reason there's no downside to insisting that government adhere to Christian morality and constitutional principles. There is no downside. As you noticed, there were people in the Republican Party that says, don't talk about the United Nations. There is no downside to speaking the truth. You still need to be courteous. You still need to practice your Christian morality when dealing with other people. It is not the platform, and it's not to your advantage to be rude or crude or in any way offensive to the agenda. But you can stand your ground. Once you hold that position, there is no downside to insisting that the truth be exposed and that we oppose this evil agenda in our community. The other thing is that we need to be aware of how the dialectic, and I'm not going to go into a great description of the dialectic, but how it's being used in your community and other aspects of the dialectical materialism, like the Delphi technique that's being used in your community. For those of you who've never heard of the dialectic, it's a very simple concept, really. You have a thesis and an antithesis. In this case, for example, the thesis many years ago was, say, Social Security. The antithesis is, we don't need Social Security. What is Social Security? When those proponents of Social Security pursued their agenda in Congress, got to the point in the pursuit of this agenda that they thought if they pushed any harder, it could jeopardize the entire effort and they could lose everything, they stopped. And they took a dialectic step backward and they offered a compromise, a synthesis, and said They stepped backward one step. Remember, they took 2 steps forward. And those who inculcate their children and their communities into this kind of dialectic thought even teach them to march, as Senator Richardson said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Net gain 1 step. In this case, whatever the pressure is, if the pressure is very great, they may only make a small gain, or they make a large gain, but they will agree to take a little bit less than they had originally thought of. Usually what happens is that the conservative community breathes a huge sigh of relief, that the battle is finally over and they can agree on something, and that we're all done and we can go home. What really happens is that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and it all starts all over again the very next day, until Social Security is completely fleshed out and is exactly the way the thesis, the original thesis, envisioned Social Security. There's also someone in our local area that does an incredible job of teaching individuals at how to defy the Delphi technique. And for those of you who don't know, the Delphi technique is a means of conducting a meeting in which they will use facilitators in small groups in order to acquire a consensus within each small group, a conceived and a predetermined consensus, and each one of those small group facilitators will then offer up this preconceived consensus that they use using this technique to gather together and show, well, it looks like everybody agrees in this particular program. And her name is Sharon Hanek, H-A-N-E-K. She's known in Washington State as the research mom, and she is an expert in teaching people how to disrupt this technique. She has actually had individuals at meetings in which they were using this technique to disrupt the Delphi, in which those at the head table quietly folded up their 3-ring binders, stood up, and walked out of the building in the middle of the meeting. Well, this is just a quick, her email is edresearch@hotmail.com, and her name is Sharon Hanek. A couple of things that influenced me: I read books, and I watch videos, and I join organizations. These are some of the books that influenced me. I read The Samaritan Strategy many years ago about how the church basically slunk off and decided they weren't going to participate in the political process. The Law by Frederick Bastiat, The 5,000-Year Leap, which is available right back here at the table, by Cleon Skousen, Christianity and the Constitution by John Eidsmoe, The Federalist Papers, Understanding the Times by Dr. David Noble. He has Summit Ministries. It teaches young people all the worldviews. Be surprised how many Christians who are active in politics that can't even describe their own worldview. The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin. Wow, I felt like I was on hallowed ground being in the same room with Mr. Griffin. The Unseen Hand by Ralph Epperson, and The Light and the Glory, and many, many others. Organizations I've been active in over the many years: the John Birch Society, which that was the first one with Yuri Bezmenov many years ago. And I joined the John Birch Society at that point, and have been, it's been my source, my rock, my source of information. Eagle Forum, of course, we'll hear from Phyllis later on. Freedom Advocates, Radio Liberty, American Policy Center, Freedom21. You've all heard of these people. I'd like to close with a poem that Dr. Stan Monteith considers an eloquent one. Once to Every Man and Nation by James Russell Lowell. And this was written in the middle of this conflict over slavery. And he said that once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide, in the strife of truth with falsehood, for the good or evil side. Then it is the brave man chooses, whilst the coward stands aside, till the multitudes make virtue of the faith they had denied. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet the truth alone is strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong, yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. And we are out of time. If you have any questions or comments or would like to know some of the things that I obviously left out of the short presentation, please contact me. I'll be around for the rest of the conference. I'd like to thank every single one of you for your attention, and I want to re-emphasize that if we hold positions of leadership within the Republican Party, we will start to see Republicans of principle, like Representative Matt Shea here, take offices, and it will inspire those individuals that the founders talked about. Remember, we only had about 15% of the people behind the founders during the period before the War for Independence. What happened is that we had Matt Shays and Randy Brogdons who were willing to stand up and speak out, who inspired the less informed, and they were very willing to follow them into battle. And I would like to encourage all of you to be people like that, to stand up and lead those of lesser courage into battle. Because right now, we're at that point. It's a do or die point. It's a time that we all must stand or accept the yoke of tyranny. Thank you.